Today, anyone who really wants to know how Hitler functioned need to do no more than procure any tape of documentary footage on Hitler and watch it attentively. Observe the gestures and the facial expression of the Führer. Listen to the sound of his ranting, euphoric voice. Read the quotations from his speeches. Then the Hitler mystique will stop being such a mystique. It is an example that can sharpen our perceptions and help us identify other, similar phenomena quickly and accurately. For political leaders in the Hitler mold, the jubilation of the masses is as indispensable to still their affective cravings as a drug is for an addict. The millions of cheering supporters do not realize that they are needed for that purpose, and that purpose alone. When Hitler painted his glowing vision of a 1,000-year Reich, free of revolutions, his listeners had no inkling whatever that their beloved and allegedly loving father was getting ready to send them off to their death in the war because his own personal biography willed it so.
People coming out, it looks like work camps, and they're all bedraggled, and it looks like they're dying. Do something. Well, I would get into my Jeep and race to the scene of the crime. There was a tank commander who was usually taken over the camp, American tank commander. And I'd go to the commander, I say, I'm here on orders of the President of the United States, carrying out a policy of the United States approved by General Patton. I want 10 men immediately to surround the Schreibstube, the office, before they got in there and everything was destroyed. But the scenes that you now are seeing on the screen was typical. Dead bodies lying all around. You couldn't tell if they were dead or alive.
Like Hitler, gurus use paternal or maternal promises of healing and salvation to achieve complete and utter devotion. Regression without awareness, the total relapse into earliest infancy, is the instrument they use to blind the masses and keep them in a state of boundless adulation. This kind of regression makes criticism of parent figures like gurus and charismatic political leaders totally impossible. Equally inconceivable is self-criticism on the part of such leaders. It has no chance against the lust of power and the lure of self-aggrandizement. Many problems appear in a new light when we look to childhood as a source of possible explanations. We are living in an age in which democracies are gaining the upper hand over dictatorships. At the same time, the cult group phenomenon is an indication that there is a growth in the number of totalitarian systems to which people voluntarily submit themselves. People growing up in a spirit of liberty and tolerance, accepted in childhood for what they are, rather than being throttled and stunted by their upbringing, would hardly place themselves at the mercy of a cult group of their own accord. And if by chance or skillful manipulation they did fall afoul of such an organization, they certainly would not stay there very long. But many people joining such groups seem completely indifferent to the fact that their new surroundings are powered by mechanisms expressly designed to subjugate them, to rob them of the freedom to think, to act, and to feel as they see fit. They seem completely impervious to the fact that such groups set out to impose an Orwellian form of surveillance, and a demand for mindless obedience, from which the prospects of escaping are more or less nil. Years of brainwashing and indoctrination ensure that the victims are kept unaware of the insidious harm being done to their personalities. They have no notion of the price they have paid for their malleability because they have no notion that there is any alternative. The thing that concerns me most about cult groups is the unconscious manipulation that I have described in detail in my work. It is the way in which the repressed and unreflected childhood biographies of parents and therapists influence the lives of children and patients entrusted to their care, without anyone involved actually realizing it. At first glance, it may seem as if what goes on in cults and cult-like therapy groups takes place on a different level from the unconscious manipulation of children by their parents. We assume that in the former instance we are in the presence of an intentional, carefully planned and organized form of manipulation aimed at exploiting the specific predicament of individuals. It would be interesting to know what it is men are most afraid of. Taking a new step, uttering a new word, is what they fear most. But I'm talking too much. It's because I chatter that I do nothing. Or perhaps it is that I chatter because I do nothing. The unconscious aspects of manipulation. In the end, they themselves became the victims of a process, inexorable logic of its own, a process they were unaware of, because they had never given it any thought. Thus, they sparked off a conflagration they were unable to control, much less extinguish. First, they had learned how to reduce people to the emotional state of a helpless child. Once they had achieved that, they also learned how to use unconscious regression to exercise total control over their victims. From then on, what they did seemed to come automatically, in accordance with the child-rearing patterns instilled into them in their own childhood. Mitter's report on the misleading blandishments that arouse false hopes and illusions also helps us to understand how political leaders operate. For years, a debate has been raging on whether Hitler actually believed what he was saying, or whether he consciously manipulated others.
I'd like to introduce Ben Ferencz, a former prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials following World War II, and throughout his life, a tireless advocate for a concept he simply refers to as law, not war. At a young 100 years old, he is truly a living legend. There are people watching today's program who very well could be the next lawyer, the next man or woman who makes the impact that Ben has made on the area of the law that we're here today to learn about. Before you were a Nuremberg prosecutor, you were an actual witness to the crimes of the Holocaust. You joined the army, you landed at Normandy, you fought the Battle of the Bulge. You were tasked by General Patton with collecting evidence of Nazi atrocities, entering camps shortly after liberation by the United States and its allies. And you were eventually tasked with helping to set up the United States' first war crimes branch in Europe. You've described the job of collecting evidence in Nazi crimes as peering into hell.
Some things, he said, are so atrocious that it is best not to talk about them. One should not try to understand what is beyond all understanding. Whether the real motive was indeed shame and not opportunism is a moot point. At all events, this kind of distancing from the past seems to me extremely problematic, in that it involves a danger of repetition on the grounds of sheer ignorance. In my opinion, it is important for us to gain a precise understanding of how such atrocities could come about, to find out exactly why so many intellectuals gave them their unconditional approval, and why they still refuse to make an honest effort to understand what happened to them, and why it happened to them. My references to Schreber and his methods will not be sufficient to explain the history of the Holocaust. Countless books have been written about it, but the enormity of those crimes still defies comprehension. Blaming the whole thing on a defective genetic blueprint is just as unsatisfactory. Why would there have been so many people born 30 or 40 years before the Holocaust in Germany with such a fateful genetic disposition? I don't know of any gene researcher who has tried to answer this question. My references to the systematic humiliation of children around the turn of the century and the torture they were exposed to, tragically never recognized as such by the parents, contain the crucial factor that explains such barbarity. Unfortunately, it has yet to be given the attention it deserves. The reasons for this neglect are probably closely connected with the general taboo that has been imposed on the subject of childhood. But for quite hardened pragmatic reasons, notably a concern for the future, it is important to break with this taboo and venture onto this largely unexplored territory.
Documented these atrocities, and you are given the opportunity to work on something that was unprecedented at the time, the trial of perpetrators at Nuremberg. How did what you saw, how did what you witnessed affect you in your role as a prosecutor?
Well, to give you just a direct answer, it has affected me so that I'm still suffering from it. I was traumatized by what I saw. And people ask me, what are you doing now? You've passed 101 years of age, and you're still working from day to night. I can't help it. I can't stop. Because I have to do whatever I can to stop it. Now, I'm perfectly aware that since war has been glorified for centuries, that I'm not going to be able to stop it by saying war is madness. War is genocide. I was the first one to use that term in my opening statement in the Einsatzgruppen trial. So I have been struggling to have what seems to me common sense acceptable, and that is, if you have a dispute, settle it by law, by lawful means only, without the use of force. If you can do that, you will have saved millions of lives. And so to persuade them that law is better than war, no matter how you cut it, this is a job for lawyers primarily. We are the people who talk about law and pass the laws. And so that has been the overriding influence in what I have been doing with my life. And lest people say it's a fool's errand. Maybe, but we are making progress. Slow progress. We may come into a discussion later. Some people don't want law. This president does not want law. He wants the International Criminal Court destroyed because it's my baby. And anybody who tries to kill my baby has got to reckon with me too.
Well, I don't think anyone in today's presentation or any of our participants would suggest this was anything close to a fool's errand. And we are going to talk about your work since Nuremberg, the obligation of never again. The center alerts leaders to conditions of genocide and the consequences of ignoring evidence.
I do not believe that material greed alone is an adequate explanation for a system of fraud so elaborate as to inevitably involve unnecessary expenditure. The point is that it is not only the victims that lapse back into an infantile state, it is the people behind the system as well. Be they little Hitlers or gurus, they bask in the admiration of their adherents, which they take to be a proof of their exceptional status and thus completely lose touch with reality. If this were not the case, Hitler would never have prolonged the Russian campaign in defiance of the advice of his experienced generals. But he was completely besotted with himself, a helpless victim of his own delusions of grandeur. His unconscious regression made him lose all control with reality and any level-headed assessment of the situation. Hitler too believed that the adulation of the masses was irrefutable evidence of his own greatness. The fact that this adulation was born of his own lies was something he could easily forget. Thus, he came to regard himself as a genius.
How else do you balance the scale? Well, I thought if I can get a judgment which will protect everybody, that would be worthwhile. And in my case, in the Einsatzgruppen case, the victims were slaughtered because they didn't share the race, the religion, or the ideology of their Nazi executioners. And I thought that was horrible. And if we could protect them against that happening again because of their color, their race, they'd be Jewish or not Jewish, that would be enforceable and would be a step forward in the law. So I was pleased when I had a case could say, look, these were the guys who murdered people because of their race or their religion. They were sentenced to death and executed. That's what they deserved. I was angry. I was anxious whether I could get the court to accept what I was arguing. These men, and I pointed to them, wrote the blackest page in human history. Life was their toy and death was their tool. If these men be immune, then law has lost its meaning. So the parameters of what I was going to say, and I rested my case 2 days, and I convicted all of them. And I didn't call a single witness. I said, I don't need any witnesses. I got the sworn documents, top secret. Witness testimony is fallible testimony. Didn't last more than 2 days. They convicted all of them, and 14 of them were sentenced to death. Was I jubilant? No, I was not. The courtroom was quiet as a mouse.
Was the tragic fulfillment of a program of intolerance and arrogance. We ask this court to affirm by international penal action man's right to live in peace and dignity, regardless of his race or creed. The case we present is a plea of humanity to law.
The total neglect or trivialization of the childhood factor operative in the context of violence and the way it evolves sometimes leads to explanations that are not only unconvincing and abortive but actively deflect attention away from the genuine roots of violence. The abstract term antisemitism contains an infinite number of meanings and frequently serves only to blur the complicated psychological processes involved, processes that need to be identified and called by name. This is the only way we can hope to change anything. Working toward a better, more aware future cannot be done in isolation from the ongoing attempt to understand our history, as individuals and as society, in all its facets. One of those facets, the history of child rearing, seems to me more eloquent than any other in illustrating the dangers for society at large attendant on willful ignorance about child development. But anyone taking a true interest in the question will be quick to recognize that in fact it is exposure to extreme physical correction, abuse, or neglect in childhood that turns out young adults who take pleasure in destruction and who worship violence. Despite the serious demonstrable harm done to the brain by physical abuse in the first 3 years, it is perhaps never too late to help the youthful victim to develop a trusting attitude if his environment shows the necessary understanding. The human brain is infinitely inventive. Under ideal conditions, it appears to be able to activate other regions to function as a substitute for those areas it has forfeited. The successes registered by circumspect therapists and humane instructors are proof of this. But the indispensable precondition is that the harm done be identified as such, not disavowed or played down. Many people are unaware of the fact that physical correction of any kind, including spanking, is invariably synonymous with mistreatment. All over the world, this fact is held to be axiomatic as far as full-grown adults are concerned. But when defenseless children are involved, the case is apparently not so clear-cut. This double standard could survive unscattered only as long as beating one's children, so-called corporal punishment, was passed off as a licit method of licking them into shape or hammering some sense into them. The consequences of such treatment, and it is no exaggeration to say that genocide and the toleration of genocide is one of them, have simply been ignored. It is one of the most tragic instances of miscommunication in the history of the world.